All right. Well, welcome everybody to meeting number 6 of the stakeholder group for the performance-based regulation study group. So again, it's the SCC who will be writing the final study, but the Virginia Department of Energy is facilitating the stakeholder portion. So we can move ahead to our list of participating organizations. We won't go through any introductions today, but just as you unmute to speak, appreciate it if you give your name and your affiliation. So then we can get into our agenda for the day. So we'll first briefly go over the survey results for the survey that we've had between this and the last meeting, trying to sort of identify where we might want to prioritize our time for this group. Then we'll start a deeper dive of that regulatory assessment exercise that you all have been working on, and really appreciate all responses to that. We'll talk at a high level, have some summary, and then we'll do some more structured discussions. Then we'll talk a little bit about our next exercise, which is we've had this backwards looking regulatory assessment. Now, to complement our kind of final comment period, maybe give structure to those final comments, we have another template that participants can use to respond. So we'll share that at the end and walk through how it can be used. So with that, Jonica, we can jump to our survey results. So again, this survey, we just use this to understand where we want to prioritize our time for this group, and where we can't address things within this group, where we may want to recommend that the Commission conduct some further study. We'll get the results up on the website pretty soon, and in this meeting and that next meeting, we'll try and address as many of the priority areas that were identified as we can. So this first slide, just a reminder of what those different performance areas are. This survey really revolved around the performance areas. So if you go to the next slide, Jonica, our first question was, which of the following performance areas do you think need attention and might be addressed with PBR tools? So pretty broad range of responses. We can see affordability and maximizing savings from energy efficiency were the most chosen, and then there was some interest also in cost efficiency and utility investments, peak demand reductions, integration of distributed resources, and decarbonization. And that matches up pretty well, I think, with where we've seen people respond to the regulatory assessment as well. So give me the next slide, Jonica. And similarly, which mechanism are people most interested to learn about as we move forward? And very even spread here, really, between reporting metrics, performance incentive mechanisms, or PIMs, as you will hear referred to a lot today, decoupling sales of electricity from utility revenues, the multi-year rate plan concept, and then the strategies to equalize financial and operational capital. Next slide, please. And then which PBR tools or alternative rate-making tools, if any, do you think could improve regulatory outcomes in Virginia? PIMs were the most popular here, and then a few people also mentioned decoupling and the metrics and scorecards. And again, I think some of our discussion today will point in that direction. And then the last one was, which of the PBR mechanisms discussed do you think might not be suitable for Virginia? Nothing here got more than one response. So at this time, I don't think there's anything we can rule out as just not being right for Virginia. I'd say everything is still very much on the table. So with that, we'll just move right ahead into our regulatory assessment responses and the summary. So you can bring up that next slide. So thank you to the 11 organizations that responded, 22 responses in all, because if for those who can't recall, each respondent took the form, they chose a performance area, so one of the performance areas labeled on the right, and then they went through each regulatory mechanism in the current structure, so things like RACs, rate reviews, the energy efficiency savings target, and then they discussed how that mechanism either did or did not incent performance in those different areas. And so you can see from the results, I mean, the areas of most interest, a couple on the clean energy side, decarbonization, energy efficiency, Then environmental justice and equity had quite a few responses, and then quite a few again in the affordability and cost control range, at affordability, peak demand reduction, and cost-effective investments. So how we're going to structure our conversation today, in a minute, we'll take a deep dive into a few of the specific mechanisms, so that we're really going to look closely at RACs, the energy efficiency targets, the existing performance mechanisms, and the backwards looking rate reviews. But first, just to give everybody a sense of what the responses were, we're going to give a quick overview of some of the responses to those performance areas that received the most attention. And we will also summarize these results for our final report, and then all the assessments are now available on our website. So if you want to go more in depth and understand why certain organizations made certain choices, made certain statements, there is really a lot of good content there between the 22 responses. So as I say, so we'll have our structured discussion in a minute. First, Janica, if we go to the next slide. Okay, so it looks like we might have one person having challenges accessing the call. We'll work on that. So I think the most popular area for attention was decarbonization. So you can glance at these different responses, and this is not exhaustive. Again, there's much more than this. But just to give you an idea of what some reflections were on how the current mechanisms incent or do not incent decarbonization, you can see in the overall category items pointing out that the pass-through costs for items such as RPS and compliance and fuel go directly to customers and do not provide a financial incentive to decarbonize. One response says that it actually promotes counterproductive actions as increased costs result in carbon leakage from the manufacturing sector, and that's actually a topic we're going to go into in more depth in the next meeting. Mention it's the general mechanisms are insufficient to prevent new gas-fired generators before the demand side options have been maximized. And then another response that says it may be too soon to tell, as the mechanisms are relatively new, with this decarbonization goal in Virginia really only coming into effect in 2020 with the Clean Economy Act. Then we get into the more specific mechanisms with decarbonization. You can see under the energy efficiency performance target, it's there's some positive views here that it results in energy savings, that lowers carbon emissions. But then another concern that it does not actually appear to incentivize the achievement or overachievement, despite how that mechanism is constructed. And again, that's something I think we'll get into a little later on when we're talking specifically about that mechanism. Then on the RACs, we have discussion all across the RACs, but one of the overall concerns was that there's no strong decarbonization incentive in there, and they also weaken the rate containment. No disincentivization to use the no disincentivization to stop using the carbon emitting fuels. Point out that deficiency payments are another pass-through cost to ratepayers, which may not disincentivize compliance, but is it, from that person's perspective, at best neutral. And then determinations for what type of projects are allowed to higher return on equity. So carbon emitting or non-carbon emitting, whatever their return on equity is for those capital investments, creates positive or negative incentives. And then this came up a couple of times, of moving more capital projects into the base rates would shift more risk to shareholders and less to the ratepayers. So again, that's just at the very high level some of the perspectives on the decarbonization. And we'll move through a few others here, but you'll start to see some overlap as we go. So if we could move on to peak demand reduction next. Yeah, you see, overall, some folks thought the current structure is very little impact. One respondent pointed out programs are voluntary, so they're effective when customers participate, but that is largely out of utilities' control. A few respondents in this area focused on the return on equity determinations and said that the preference for capital investments in generating resources over other methods to address demand is a disincentive. They mentioned the delta between the cost of borrowing and the return on equity creates a further capital bias. And then that may also incentivize utility to favor increased load growth. So some mention of the gold plating there, or I guess also the throughput incentive that we heard last week from our presentation from RAP. So then if we move on to the rate reviews and how they may or may not affect peak demand reduction. So some folks thought they did not, but they mentioned there's no demand response mechanism in the base rates. And then that look ahead, one person mentioned the lack of decoupling mechanisms. That is where the rates are decoupled from the throughput, and then, in theory, that incentivizes energy efficiency. So right now we don't have such a mechanism in our structure. Then again, lots of focus on the racks. Mentions that there is no great incentive for cost containment, and from a number of stakeholders' perspectives. One person mentioned that important question of what's the overall effect of the different racks, and we've mentioned that before, that we're going to have to think about the interactions between these different mechanisms, as they will pull in different directions depending on the performance area. Further mentions of the bias towards capital investment, and then similar concerns regarding the pass-through of fuel costs, as we saw with the decarbonisation. And then energy efficiency also received a lot of attention. We'll have a quick look at that next. And so again, I mean, I think you start to see some themes develop here. It mentions the current structure favors capital projects, another mention of that throughput incentive instead of demand side measures. I mentioned that Dominion did not meet its 2022 target, so questioning if the targets are fully effective if they're not being met. But then when we get into the specific performance measure, there is a mention that energy savings have increased, and an observation that 20 basis points adder for every 0.1% of overachievement on the energy efficiency target is an example of a positive PIM, performance incentive mechanism. But also, again, that concern that the mechanism has not resulted in the targets actually being met. Some discussion in the racks that they do not affect this outcome directly, but simply mention again that they see some of the respondents see that preference for capital investment as weakening the incentives on the demand side management measures. Some mention of the integrated resource plan, the IRP, for this one. So some respondents don't see it as having a major impact in this area, but then others are seeing that as failing to provide a proper platform for the consideration of energy efficiency investments. And then the last one we'll just have a quick look at before we get into our discussion is affordability. And so now we really see a lot of the same concerns coming up again, concerns that racks do not have sufficient cost containment. One mentioned that any change to the process to do with performance-based rate making or not should maintain commission approval for construction and cost recovery associated with individual projects. So that respondent doesn't want to see a case for individual generation facilities or transmission lines, demand side management programs, whatever it may be, are not given individual scrutiny. And some people mentioned the rate reviews under this one, and the frequent rate cases, which currently they're biennial for our IOUs, that these erode cost containment incentives. If I suppose the implication that maybe a multi-year plan may work better in that instance. Again, mentioning the performance adjustment, energy efficiency target. Pardon me. And so to the extent that the programs are cost effective, they are mitigating the need for new infrastructure investment and benefiting affordability. Again, lots of comments on the racks. One individual or organization saying that the costs are not subject to the basic incentives of traditional rate making, and that these racks or trackers, as they're sometimes known, are more common in Virginia than they are in a lot of other states. Comments that the annual reconciliation of racks erodes incentive for cost containment, so that's a similar concern as with the frequent rate cases. And then again, we hear that concern about the pass-through cost for fuel not providing an incentive to lower costs in that area. So that's just a very quick look at some of the responses. Now we'll go into more of our discussion, where we'll try and focus on a few of the mechanisms, and in doing so, we'll talk across all these different areas. So if we go to the next slide. So for our discussion, really three things we're trying to achieve. One is sort of understand the perspectives on the mechanism. So make sure we understand what the different concerns are and what the possible solutions could be. Try and identify where there's alignment or divergence in the stakeholder perspectives. And then finally, once we've got to that point, begin to consider what the appropriate PBR solutions might be in each of those areas. And really, we got 11 responses. There are a lot more people in this group, so really encourage those who just, for whatever reason, were not able to provide assessments to still speak up and offer their perspectives where you feel able. So if we go to our first point of discussion, we just, oh, forgive me. Well, first we're going to talk about the racks. So just wanted to remind everybody what the different racks are. We're going to talk about them broadly overall, but as we're discussing, I'm sure we'll use individual racks to illustrate our points. So we're talking overall, but if the points you want to make are specific to fuel cost recovery or purchase power, please go ahead. And this is just a reminder of the different rack categories that are out there. So if we go to the next slide. This is just a quick collection of some of the responses, just trying to capture the key or common points that were made. And what I'm going to suggest is if everybody could just take 1 minute, hopefully that's clear on everybody's screen. If everybody could just take 1 minute to read through these, and then we'll kind of go through our questions. Make sure everybody firstly understands what they're reading here, and then start to get into the discussion. So I'll give you a minute.
Larry, is there any way to make that text a little larger?
Thank you.
I'm working on a little postage stamp sized laptop and I can barely see it.
Gotcha. Is that possible, Jonica?
Yeah,
let me try. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, on your individual screens on the left-hand side, there should be like a plus and minus sign next to the presenter's name where you can zoom in and it'll zoom in on your screen, if that helps. At least that option is visible on my computer.
Thanks, Katsa. I can try. I would have to refresh the slides.
Oh, that's good.
I would have to probably scroll through a few things here. So
go back. Go back. Go back. Go back. Go back.
Sure if that's working.
I've got another comment here that you can hold Control on your keyboard and scroll forward with your mouse, and that'll help to increase the size of the window as well.
Is that helpful?
Yep, John.
Yeah, I think it helps now. I've got it set to showing it at a much higher screen.
Also,
So thank you.
I think if you look down, so I can see Jonica's name there, and on Jonica's name there is like 3 dots and a plus sign. So if I do plus sign, then the screen it appears bigger for me.
Thanks, Robita. I made the text a little bigger, so not sure if that helped. I would do it again for other slides if that's helping. Just let me know.
Yeah, I think that's a little easier if you're able to bump up the other slides. That would be great. So we'll go ahead. Just I know some people are probably still reading, but just the very first question is just, would anyone like clarification on any of the items listed here? And we may have the individual respondent or at least somebody similarly minded who may be able to explain. So it's anything here just initially that requires clarity.
Oh, Larry,
Laura?
this is.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Laura, I thought I saw your hand raised.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, there's one that says overall the impacts of RACs for capital projects and fuel cost recovery dwarf the impact of the other RACs. Is that something you could tease apart for us?
Well, I'm gonna put that out if the person or organization that put that out there wants to speak, or if anyone else has a perspective, is able to kind of clarify that point. I would imagine it is in terms of just sheer dollar figures, capital investments and fuel probably are of magnitudes greater than some of the other racks that are out there. And in doing so, probably have a much greater influence on, incentives. All right, Laura, did you have something?
I just was going to say that it could be helpful also to contextualize the discussion around RACs, kind of understanding how much different RACs are from traditional rate recovery, and so why is it so different? So I don't know. I mean, I think we generally understand why it's so different, but I think it will be kind of helpful. I don't know if we have help from the commission to kind of understand, what's the critical difference between a RAC recovery mechanism and a traditional rate making, even before the 2007 Re-Regulation Act.
Yeah. Do we have any volunteers from the commission or anyone else to make that distinction? John, are you volunteering to explain?
Well, I think I have a related comment or question, and that is that if you go back far enough in history, and I just had a conversation with a gentleman who's been retired from Dominion for about 15 years, and he worked for Dominion for about 30 years. So he remembers when it was Virginia Electric Power Company, and really RACs are not something that has historically been part of Virginia rate making. If you go back far enough in history, like there used to just be the fuel rider. That was it. Everything else was base rates. And it would be interesting to see, was there any reason why we decided to start putting in RACs? And is there any explanation for how come we now have so many? And are we really undermining the process of base rate design when you itemize all of the capitalized costs? And so it's kind of a related thought, a related question. And there are people who could probably provide that historical perspective if we sought them out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm happy to divide it into two. Maybe for now, could we focus on the technical question Laura asked, and then we could get a little more into the history and the perspectives on them. Is there somebody who would be able just to explain to the group where RACs and base rates differ? Carmen?
Sorry, actually, I was going to answer John's inquiry and just tell him I was going to email him a little brief history. Anybody who's been around since the early 2000s, when we re-regulated after we deregulated, can give you a good history on why we have RACs now. But RACs are basically, they're essentially capital projects that are, it's a mechanism that is used by the utility to be able to recover the cost of actually being able to finance, obtain the money from from the investors in order to build the capital projects for generation plants, for distribution and transmission projects, that kind of guarantees a return for those investors in order to make it, much more attractive for those investors to provide the money to the utility company to build these necessary projects. when we re-regulated, that's when the RACs came into play and became far more prevalent in our rate making process, because it was a way to make sure that that those investors would have some guarantee that they were going to get a return on that money that they were providing. Because these projects are not, small amounts of money by any means, and so these are large investments that these individuals, these organizations, these corporations are making in order to get some return on their money. So that's just kind of like the basic overall of why we have the RACs. And that is the difference between the RAC and the base rate. The base rate is everything that the utility has in its portfolio, both assets and then operating and maintenance, in order to provide the service that they are providing to their customers. And so it's all their capital assets that they have. So their generation plants, their wires, their poles, as well as all of the operation to run the company and to maintain those assets that they have. And so that is what a base rate is, while the RAC is actually only the recovery for a particular project. Now, traditionally, the RAC or rider in another state would typically just be the cost that is incurred on these projects during the construction phase, so that that is the only part of the RAC that you see. But once that project, let's say it's a generation plant, actually gets into service, then the cost for that plant then is then transferred into the base rate, and the RAC goes away. And so your base rate will probably increase, but you won't have that RAC in there. In Virginia, however, we just keep the RAC through the construction phase and straight on through its life performance, in a RAC, rather than rolling it into the base rate. And as far as, what that entails in terms of the cost to the ratepayers, that's something that I think, that's beyond my capabilities. You would have to have, probably staff at the SCC, or even, who was it, RAP, do some, somebody who's got that utility financing and rate making background to be able to determine where the benefit and the pros and cons of all of it.
Yeah, but thanks, Carmen. There seems to be some interest in your history of RAC. So if you could share that with Jonica, we'd be happy to put it in the website or put it out in an email. Did Brian from the SCC, I think it was mentioned in the chat, may have come offline, or sorry, come off mute to add some more clarity here.
Hi, Larry. Just wanted to respond to Laura's question real quick, because she asked for SCC input, and I think Carmen provided a lot of very helpful background and information as well. But just at a high level, Laura, if your question, as I essentially understand it, is what's the basic difference between base rates versus a RAC? Let me know if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, that's essentially your question, kind of what are those differences? A lot of it really stems from Virginia code. For example, generally speaking, a utility is permitted to recover its cost of service, which includes like its capital cost, its operation and maintenance expenses, plus a fair rate of return that is typically set by the commission. There are rate adjustment clauses set forth in the Code of Virginia, and a lot of times the Code of Virginia specifies what types of items and or projects are permissible for RAC recovery, and again, that's kind of specified in the Code of Virginia. And then cost of service that is not broken out in a RAC by a utility, pursuant to those various code sections, are then kind of by default covered through base rates. And again, it's kind of outlined in the code, but various types of cost could be recovered through a RAC. Cost related to things such as energy efficiency programs, for example, certain generation facility cost can be recovered through a rack, and there's a pretty wide-ranging list of various things that are eligible for rack recovery. But for the most part, it's prescribed by code, and that's kind of the key difference from my perspective. And hopefully that answers your question. And generally, in terms of functional differences, if you have base rates, cost recovered through base rates, there's what we call an opportunity to earn a rate of return. Whereas if it's in a rack, there's a true-up mechanism whereby the company does recover its cost and a rate of return through that true-up process. And that is a fundamental distinction as well. Again, that's a high-level answer. If you want to go into the specific details about really the detailed nature of the cost between the two, we would probably need some folks from our accounting group to go more into that detail. And I do not believe we have anybody from our accounting group on the call today, but maybe that's something we could arrange for next time.
Thanks, Brian. John, did you have a follow-up?
Sure.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask Brian if I understood him correctly. I'm just going to see if I can take what you said and tell me if I'm understanding it correctly. Racks basically disaggregate the capital expenses from the overall expenses of the utility. It says this particular project, whatever it may be, isn't going to be part of the aggregate total of all costs. It's going to be its own separate item. And then the way it's recovered is done a little bit differently without getting into the weeds about the details. But is it true then to also say that if there's the guarantee, like there's no at risk with a rack, but if you have to put everything together and make the entire puzzle work, the big aggregate problem of putting all your capital expenditures, all your operating expenditures all into one base rate, wouldn't that potentially be a way to incentivize a utility to be really very careful with how they make their investments? Or do you think I'm reading too much into that?
Well, it's difficult for me to speak from the company's perspective. I think what I can say in terms of cost recovery, there's generally less risk associated with cost recovery for costs that are recovered through a rack because of the true-up process, where there may be a little more risk for cost recovery associated with items and base rates. How that incentivizes the utility and so on and so forth, I'm not sure I would be able to specifically answer that question, but I can at least factually address your question in that way. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. You can't know what the utility might actually think or feel about that, but it does seem like if you had something at risk, you'd probably be much more conservative in your decision making compared to if you had no risk, where you probably wouldn't necessarily be as conservative, just in a general sense.
Understood.
Thanks. And we have one follow-up question on this. I see in the chat, Jim is asking, is there an average value for a rack? And I think he specifically in terms of rate of return. So I suppose that would be the comparison, the rate of return on a rack compared to the rate of return on the base rate.
That's correct.
I would just say that is not a question I can answer. I think we would probably need somebody from our accounting group to answer that specific question.
Okay, thank you.
Right, Rachel.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks for your input, Brian. I had a question. Is there a timing difference? Like I know the review process for rates versus racks are not necessarily on the same timeline, but my understanding was that like rack recovery can happen somewhat expeditiously as compared to something that were in base rates in the recovery timeline. And is that the case?
So when you say recovery timeline, are you referring to the procedure, that the timeline for when maybe things get trued up, or the timeline for when cases occur? Or are you talking more about the recovery timeline of, for example, a project cost overall?
The latter.
Help me maybe clarify that. So that is not a question I would be able to answer, unfortunately. Again, I think we may need somebody from our accounting group to talk that through.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Excellent. And Laura?
Yeah, and I think, you know, what I mean, looking to Brian and other state corporation commission staff to, you know, help us here. But I think one of the other fundamental differences is that if in the previous year the utility for some reason under recovered, let's say they sold less, you know, energy because there was mild weather, or they had, you know, higher costs in whatever project they were developing, they can come to the commission and say, hey, we, for this particular project under RAC, the revenues were not enough to cover all our costs and profits. So the customers next year have to make us whole, meaning they have to basically guarantee that we recover costs and profits. Instead, with the base rates, if you have a budget, and if you know face normal business risk, if you under recover, then you cannot you know, make the utility whole, because the utility will have to face that business risk, which is kind of the situation where every other business in operating competitive markets are. You know, like you operate in the market and sometimes you sell more, you sell less, and you will have more or less profits. And the more efficient you are, then the better positioned you are to make sure that market fluctuations are not as impactful. But nobody's going to make you whole in the competitive market. So that's kind of one of the main difference in the RAC. For you when that's the main difference of the RAC instrument, is that customers have to make the utility whole for under earnings, regardless of, you know, the reason, which is why RAC recovery is less risky for utilities, but it shifts the risk from shareholders to customers.
Understood. Yes, and what you're describing there is the true process for a RAC, and that is, you know, kind of the fundamental distinction between a RAC and base rates. Is for a RAC there is a true process for possible over or under earnings on a going forward basis.
John?
Yeah, thank you. I have another question that's related to RACs, and it may be more technical than someone could answer in this venue, but it might be interesting to know. So the utilities are going to be paying, you know, taxes on their assets, on their physical property, and they're probably going to be doing, you know, some kind of depreciation value to try to get the value of the property as close to zero as fast as they can. Like modified accelerated cost recovery system, or MACRS, is one of the common ways to depreciate property. Is there any relation to the value of the asset as reported to the IRS and the value of the asset as reported to the SEC? Because it seems like on the one hand, the value's trying to be brought down to zero as quickly as possible. On the other hand, the value of the asset is maintained in perpetuity throughout the life of the asset, and the ratepayers are paying it back when the IRS thinks the value of the piece of property is zero. Does that make any sense, or am I overdoing the complication of this?
I think I understand what you're asking, and unfortunately that's not a question I would be able to answer. I do not know how the utilities you know, report their assets for tax purposes, or how that may or may not relate to, you know, cost recovery through a RAC, unfortunately.
No problem. That it is a very technical question, but I wonder, Larry, if that could be something we might hear from someone who might know at some point in the future, please, possibly.
Yeah, we can add that. I mean, if we do have a number of questions for SEC accounting staff, we might be able to roll them up into our next meeting. That I see Tanisha shares Rachel's question. Well, maybe Laura's next question will go the same way. Laura asks, how frequently do utilities credit customers for over recovery under a RAC?
I'm not sure I could answer the frequency of when it happens. I think what I can say is through the RAC recovery process, if there is an over recovery, then typically within that next rate year, that's at issue in that particular proceeding that's being evaluated, there would be a kind of an offset to the revenue requirement through the RAC in that case, basically a credit mechanism that would take place. Now, how often that occurs, I can't speak to.
Thanks, Brian. So to start us off here, any other clarifying questions on I suppose RACs in general, but also on what you're reading here, the responses? Yes, Laura.
Yeah, I think another interesting kind of fundamental concept is the opportunity to earn a profit versus a guaranteed profit. I think that's for those of us who read testimony and nerd out about it, that's kind of the fundamental premise of utility regulation, that the utilities should have an opportunity, which means if they manage their business prudently, efficiently, and reasonably, they should have an opportunity to earn a profit. But with RACs, we're guaranteeing profit recovery, which is against utility monopoly regulation. So yeah, that's kind of a fundamental premise, and why traditional regulatory literature warns against excessive usage of these mechanisms.
Thanks, Laura. And then our next question for the group is just, after having read what's here, are there any other perspectives on RACs that you would want to add? And one that I suppose isn't captured here, we did have one or two respondents who, expressed that they're generally satisfied with the structure in Virginia. So I don't think they specifically addressed RACs, but I think RACs would have been included as something they thought did provide a robust arrangement. But having read this, is there any other perspectives on RACs that anyone would bring? It could be something completely different, or maybe there's something here that you largely agree with, but you would offer a slightly different perspective on the issue or the possible solution.
This is Tim McCormick. Just responding to Laura's point on the thing. I don't like to be an apologist for the utilities, because I fight them on these RACs on a pretty regular basis. But I will say that as a general rule, I'd say you see under recovery more often than over recovery, but over recovery is not, a complete rarity. It's not as if it never happens. It does. It is something that I know staff and other case participants do keep a pretty close eye on, and it's not unusual. It's not terribly unusual to see an over recovery in a year, in a given year, and that's applied to reduce the revenue requirement in the upcoming rate year.
Thanks, Tim. Carmen?
Yeah, not one that you typically would see defending the status quo right now. But I think on the one hand, I feel like the RACs are a necessary evil in order to make sure that we get the investors to come to bring their money to Virginia. I mean, it's not as difficult as some would try to make it out to be, but it is a good incentive for them to choose us over another utility or another state in order for these investments to go in. However, I think they have a limited usage. I think during the construction period that is a good tool for us to have in order to drive that investment in Virginia. But then I think that once that project actually becomes useful and is producing what it needs to be producing, I think that those really, and I'm talking specifically about capital asset projects such as generating plants and new transmission lines and distribution lines. But once they're actually online and being used, like the rack doesn't serve the right purpose anymore. It all of that should be counted for in the base rate, and we should have those moved to a base rate at that point. So there should be a time limit on how long those racks should be in play.
Thanks, Carmen. Any other perspectives just on racks or what you're reading here?
I think there is a clarification question from John on Carmen's comment.
Thanks. Yes, Carmen, John's asking if you're suggesting a defined sunset period that is significantly shorter than it would currently be. So I think if I heard right, the distinction is the construction phase into the operational phase.
Correct. It's the two different phases of the project itself. It's not necessarily a sunset. It is actually triggered by when that, let's just say it's a generation rack, when that particular generation facility is now powering Virginia's grid. It's no longer in construction, is actually working.
Thanks. Does anybody else have comments, responses? Yeah, Rachel.
I just want to perhaps offer a cautionary comment. And Carmen, in your construct of sort of bifurcating the rack, I think the current rack structure doesn't really have an incentive for cost containment. So to the extent the construction phase, like if the projected amount is actually exceeded, the utility can still come in for a true up. And granted, the commission has the opportunity to evaluate whether the utility will receive full recovery for that. But I think there are also some things to consider in thinking about whether it's just for that first construction point, and what just cost containment mechanisms might need to be in place to incentivize smart choices there.
Just in response to Rachel, I would agree, but I think that's needed in the current rack process as it is. I don't think that is, I mean, the SEC staff does a great job of looking at these things, but the incentives, as you're talking about, do not exist. And that is not in the current structure process, the current process that we have right now.
I don't disagree. I think we're on the same page. If I'm understanding you right, yeah.
Thank you. And then Laura adds on to that she doesn't think it's necessarily a cost containment issue, but that a rack should be justified each time the utility wants to use it. Okay. Oh, well, the SEC have called for the cavalry. So we have some accounting staff on now. So we could circle back to those questions. And I had jotted them down, but maybe the best way is to go back to the askers. So I know that Rachel, the first one I had listed was from you about the rack timeline. If you wouldn't mind repeating that.
Sure, thanks. I was just curious if there was a difference in timing in terms of recovery, like for a project, when it's fully recovered in a rack versus if it were recovered through base rates. I thought there was some component of like expeditious recovery that's associated with the rack, and I was just trying to get clarity on that.
Sure. This is Patrick Carr with SCC staff. I'm in utility accounting and finance. I don't know about cavalry. I don't want to get anyone's hopes up, but yeah, I think generally speaking, there is more timely recovery through racks, and that would be, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, racks can be updated and often are updated annually. Whereas for, of course, as you all know, for APCO and Dominion, for their base rates, they're on a biennial review. schedule where those are looked at every 2 years. So you got more frequent rate adjustments usually. Dominion's biennial review, one caveat, they even though it's every 2 years, they can kind of have a step multi-year rate plan through that. So actually their rates can change every year, but they're only, reviewed every 2 years. So I'd say yeah, usually a little quicker, not tremendous difference, but a little bit quicker recovery through racks, I would say, generally speaking. Hopefully
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, that responds to my question. Thank you.
Right.
Thanks, Patrick. And then John, you had a question about racks and taxes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I'll try to rephrase it and keep it short. So obviously the value of the capital asset is taxed, and the utility or the owner of the asset is going to try to depreciate the value of that property as quickly as possible so they pay as small a tax liability as they can. And so on the one hand, you're trying to depreciate the value down to zero as quickly as you can. On the other hand, you're trying to recover the full cost and maintain this rack, even into the operational phase of the generation equipment, if that's what the rack is for. And I'm wondering, do those two reporting mechanisms have any bearing on one another, or should they have any bearing on one another? Or is it just completely separate and have no connection at all?
Okay, so a couple things. One, I take it from the context of the question, when you're talking about taxes, you're talking about property taxes.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple things I would say to that. One, the value of the property for property tax purposes, not that I just got here and I'm already punting, but the value of utility property for property tax purposes, the assessment is done by folks in our public service taxation division, and it's not necessarily and it isn't directly tied to the depreciated book value of the assets. Of course, the depreciated book value and the timeline for that you alluded to, that's how they get their cost recovery through, the rate mechanisms that we're talking about. But the assessment for property tax values can be on, sort of a different time schedule as far as declining over time. So they're a little separated. To take that last question first, they're separated. And then lastly, I guess I would just add that for rate recovery purposes, again, not taxation, but for rate recovery purposes, the goal, and there can be debates about what the right numbers are, but the goal is that the property is paid for by customers through that depreciation. So the depreciable life is, we try to match that up with the useful service life of the asset, not influenced by goals of maybe doing it faster or shorter or longer for whatever reasons one might have. So for rate making, it's tied and it's reviewed periodically to make sure that we're on a good schedule for rate recovery over the service life, and it is a different life and a different kind of, I don't want to use the word depreciation because that's kind of what we do, but a different schedule for tax purposes. So hopefully that's helpful.
It does help. It helps me understand the context where both of the pieces of data are used, but it does kind of feel like it's, well, I don't want to come off negative, but it's like one face is saying one thing and the other face is saying something else, a little bit, but I see where it may not be connected that way.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to the goal of the depreciation on the rate side that I'm involved in. The goal is to kind of match that up with the service life. I think the goal, without being an expert in it, the goal on the taxation side is more of a value measurement of the equipment.
Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate it. It does help.
Thanks, Patrick. And then Laura, do you want to ask your question about cost recovery?
Yes. So my initial question was, if we go back, before the re-regulation, before 2007, because that's when we established first the biennial reviews. If we go, and then we had deregulation. So if we go back before, to the traditional rate making system, the utilities, spend money, and then they have to prove prudency, and the commission might deny those costs if the expenditure was imprudent. And that's kind of a risk for the utility, and they have to be very careful. And between rate cases, if costs grow faster than revenues, then shareholders might be at risk, right? So the utility has to be very careful at how they manage their costs in between rate cases. But with RACs, those costs can be true up faster, so that risk of under recovery is gone. So that's kind of what I understand the regulatory lag is. So I was wondering if you could kind of explain how that regulatory lag risk and that incentive to control cost work before 2007.
Sure. Yeah. So I think you described it very well. Yeah. Before 2007, under I call it traditional, although 2007 was a long time ago. So I don't know if traditional is the right word to use anymore. But it was, like you said, there was for putting fuel costs aside, which have been in a tracker for a very long time, but everything else was through base rates. They were reviewed periodically when a utility filed a rate case. There wasn't a required biennial timing or anything. And just like you said, if costs rose faster than revenue in between rate cases, there was the potential for some attrition on the earned return for shareholders. Conversely, it should be said, conversely, if revenues, grew faster than cost, either because of, cost containment or strong growth in sales, shareholders could benefit. It worked both ways. And now, of course, with RACs, base rates, we talk about an opportunity to recover the cost, and that's kind of what I just described. There's no guarantee. Earnings might be lower or higher than what had been authorized, whereas a RAC is and y'all probably been talking about this, dollar for dollar mechanism that gets, you used the term trued up, gets trued up to what the actual costs were, whether they were higher or lower than had been sort of projected. So, I mean, I think that's one of the main differences we talk about when we're talking about pre 2007 and today.
Thanks, Patrick. And then one more question we had from earlier is if there is an average value for a RAC. In other words, what is the average rate of return to the investor, I suppose, in comparison to the base rate?
So the authorized returns are the authorized return on equity is generally going to be the same for a RAC and for base rates. There have been times in the past, and still maybe for certain, I know this is an electric focused thing, but for certain gas riders where there were bonuses to the ROE, where you'd add 100 basis points to what had been authorized in base rates when you're determining the RAC ROE. But that's, off the top of my head, I think pretty much done now for electric. So they're basically going to be the same authorized ROE. The main difference, is a good segue from the last question, is the difference between an opportunity to recover versus a dollar for dollar mechanism. Yeah, and I do want to mention one thing that I say again. I just hopped on, but I saw on some discussion about cost containment and such. While the RACs are a dollar for dollar mechanism, they're not. That I wouldn't want to suggest and and they're not a simple, kind of automatic pass through. I mentioned they're typically updated every year. They're updated through full litigated proceedings, where staff and other stakeholders have, full ability and do, audit the costs, review them for prudency and accuracy and things like that. So that still takes place. That's not a difference between racks and base rates. They're subject to the same scrutiny and I would say the same, those traditional reasonable and prudent type standards. I mean, and in fact, they're looked at more frequently. Whether that's a feature or a bug, I guess is up to the beholder, but definitely want to make sure that that's clear. They're not automatic recovery.
Thanks, Patrick. Any other questions that may be directed to Patrick while we have him on the line?
I think John's comment in the chat has also a question.
Oh.
Or maybe just a discussion.
I was reading that more as a discussion for the group, but John, is there a question in there for Patrick?
Well, I mean, Patrick, if you think that it doesn't represent the facts as they've been presented to us in terms of what I'm saying, then please, this would be a good time to tell us that it's wrong. But I think that it was more for a discussion for the group.
Yeah, I'm just reading the comment now. Yeah, so I think I think what you're speaking to is again this sort of distinction and all the resulting incentive differences and so forth. Which people would debate maybe, but the difference between that opportunity to recover in base rates versus the sort of trued up dollar for dollar recovery in Iraq and similar trackers.
Thanks, Patrick. In that case, well, I was going to read it out, mate. John, would you want to put your question to the group?
Sure. So I was just followed up when Laura was saying about how, well, I won't try to recapture here things. I think we all agree that RACs as they exist today are not necessarily incentivizing utility to contain costs because there is no risk for recovery. And if we are trying to incentivize cost containment, rolling RACs back into the base rate does create risk, which naturally incentivizes caution and a desire to contain costs because you may not recover your investment. There's the opportunity, but not the guarantee. And so I think that's just it's a natural consequence and a natural incentive. And I'm just wondering if there are stakeholders who disagree with that.
Not hearing any disagreement, but I would ask, is anybody on from either of the utilities? Because I know at least in some of their responses, they were more positive about the current structure generally. So would be interested to hear if they have the perspective on the racks. Well, not hearing anyone. So, oh, sorry, Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I put my question in the chat as well, but I'll just verbalize it here. Wondering if there's analysis that folks are aware of that sort of point to other states in terms of how, yeah, it's my understanding that Virginia is a bit of an outlier on the rate, or I'm sorry, the RAC construct. But maybe it would be helpful to hear from State Corporation Commission staff who are more plugged into NARUC or other resources to see like if there are similar structures in other states that this compares to, or if what Laura's saying around Virginia being an outlier is accurate in your perspective. Any insights into this?
Anybody from the commission?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit to it, but only a little because I haven't done any comprehensive surveys or research. So I can't say whether if you put all the commissions, all the states on a spectrum from no rack, strictly base rates to you know the I don't know, the most racks, whatever you want to call it. And of course, there's a lot of the details. What one state might call a rack might actually work quite differently than what another state might call the exact same thing. They might also call it a rack, but they're also called things like riders. California calls them memo accounts. There's a lot of different terms, and probably I one thing I'd probably say for certain is that no two states riders are exactly the same. There may be differences in the returns. There may be differences in the timing of recovery, the frequency with which they're updated, things like that. So, get some caveats out of the way. But I know we're not unique in, using a fair bit of racks. Now, I'm not saying we're in the majority. I don't know whether we are or we're not. I know Ohio uses a lot of riders. California has a lot of they use some different terminology, but a lot of siloed rate mechanisms. Pennsylvania has quite a few. They were one of the first states to really start using these for infrastructure replacement back in the 90s. So that's just a few offhand. West Virginia, I'm familiar with their there's something called an expanded net energy. I can't remember what the C stands for, maybe clause, but it recovers not just fuel, but environmental investments, transmission costs. Not uncommon for transmission costs to be in a rider in different states. So I don't know where, I can't say where Virginia would fall on that sort of hypothetical spectrum. I can say we're not altogether unique, but I don't know if that's some help. I see there's some info and a link in the chat. And then as far as other resources that also might have done some of that research, I'm not offhand familiar that NARUC has, but though they may have, NARUC, EEI, Edison Electric Institute. I know that's a utility trade organization, but they do a lot of research comparing different states. Those off the top of my head might be some groups that have done more comprehensive research. So I wish I had that comprehensive research to share with you, but those are just a few thoughts.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks. And then Joe, I see your hand up next.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. I think this has been a useful discussion. I just want to say for the record, I don't know if I have enough information to say whether I agree or disagree in terms of racks not incentivizing cost containment. And I also wonder, I'll throw this out there, whether racks may help incentivize other types of goals or performances that we want. And please, people on the line are much more versed in this than me or know this. I'll just give an example. My understanding is the General Assembly passed legislation in 2024 that would allow for a rack for investment in small modular reactors. And that's a case where I think what they were looking at was how do we increase our firm non-greenhouse gas emission baseload of energy. And so I think I don't think we can categorize racks necessarily as one thing in terms of that. And I just wonder. So just offering that. And just to be clear, I just want to make sure that because I know you're kind of tabulating where the stakeholders are, and I just don't know enough to know whether I agree with that statement.
No, that makes perfect sense. As to your other comments, I mean, I think as our experts have pointed out, there are so many mechanisms, and they create dynamic incentives that will push towards one performance area, but then may negatively impact another. Laura?
Yeah, I just shared in the chat this slide that was part of Dominion Energy's shareholder investor call, just to answer a little bit Carrie's question about, you know, how common are riders in other states. And, you know, from BPLC's research, our own investigations, and you know, our understanding of the situation is that RACs, first of all, are very common for fuel. That started in the 70s. And there was a long, you know, heated debate about whether or not the utilities should be allowed, even that one RAC, because of the incentive issue we've been discussing. You know, if you go back in the 70s, there were a lot of detractors, and you know, it took a long time for utilities to get that benefit for the fuel factor. But in recent years, so utilities have been allowed to use these RACs for other expenses. However, the usage of RACs in other states are a lot more limited to strategic investments. So things that the utility are not incentivized to spend on, for example, energy efficiency, demand response. Those are programs that go against utilities' bottom line, because if you reduce energy sales, that could affect profits for the utility. So it makes sense that you put it in a RAC as a tool for incentivizing investment in those type of things. So I think our position is that RACs essentially de-risk capital investment. So further de-risk capital investment. So as we all learned in this process, the utilities earn a rate of return based on how large their base rate is, how expensive capital is. And so this further incentivizes expenses in those type of investments, right? But the problem in Virginia is that we have RACs for everything. So we have RACs for nuclear, gas plants, even a coal plant, solar, energy efficiency, everything. So we're not really incentivizing anything in particular. We're just de-risking every type of capital expense. So I just put in the chat this information that Dominion shared, showing that $35.5 billion are 75% of $35.5 billion are eligible for riders versus, you know, Dominion Energy South Carolina. Of course, Dominion Energy South Carolina is much smaller, but this is just to show kind of how disproportionate the use of riders are in Virginia. So basically, we are not incentivizing anything in particular. We're just de-risking every capital expenditure. It doesn't matter what it is. Disincentivizing cost control for everything. So that's where we have to decide. Is like, what does the utility really need an incentive for? They don't need incentive to spend in expensive capital projects, because that's how they make money. And we all need those good capital expenses projects, but we don't need to kind of de-risk even further that operation, because that's what they know how to do, and they've been doing for centuries. So why should we take away cost containment incentives for those type of investments? So yes, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. And it's hard to keep up with all the good information being shared in the chat. But I see, Tim, you had shared the bill increases and the proportion of the bill increases that are made up of RACs. Would you provide any more context there?
I mean, I don't think that it's. I mean, what I'll say is that the SCC does a fantastic report every year on the status of the Virginia Electric Utility Regulation Act that provides some good information about, you know, where rate, you know, how rates are going up, what's driving it. And I don't. I mean, we've been talking for a while now. Now, I don't think that it's I think it's pretty clear that Dominion and APCO, you know, in recent years have a lot of their new projects have come from, have been funded by RACs. A lot of that is the Virginia Clean Economy Act. A lot of that is an intentional choice in order to make sure that, I mean, and some of that's driven by just the statute. Some of that's driven by necessity. again, I hate being an apologist for Dominion just because it's not as fun for me. But but I guess my point is that a lot of the rack growth that you're seeing here, and some of the, you don't want to look at it in isolation. A lot of the rack growth that we've seen here is from, say, the offshore wind rider, and because that's recovered on a different basis than base rates, it's capturing shopping customers, for instance. It's recovered through a rack instead of base rates in order to make sure that the people that have to pay for it under the statute are paying for it. Same thing for the RPS rack, and same thing for lots of other racks that are out there. Some of it is driven by just choices that the utilities make, and some of it is driven by statute and choices that the General Assembly.
Thanks, Tim. And then Kerry, I see you had a comment maybe about, is that about changing where these incentives are directed?
Yeah, I guess thinking about the, profit opportunity around energy efficiency compared to capital investments. So the question was asked, like, what is it that we want to incentivize, or what is a type of investment that may need a focal point or incentive? So just thinking through, like, distinguishing characteristics between different types of investments. And so I guess it's a question or a query.
Yeah, that's right. Laura, did you have something to respond there?
I wish. But no, I mean, again, like in general, we're moving towards a system where everything will be recovered through a rider, and and so basically we're eliminating cost containment incentives. It doesn't matter if it is, taking away my hat of, it's from a customer perspective, from a ratepayer perspective. It doesn't matter if we buy offshore wind, or if we buy coal, or if we buy natural gas, or if we buy solar. We are just moving towards a system where every single capital investment, is recovered through racks. And so there are fundamental differences in terms of cost containment incentives. So that's kind of the question that is in front of us. Regardless of the type of investment you do, is this the right way to recover costs and make sure that the utility has an incentive to cost control? And if we want to use riders as an incentive, to spend money, then what are those areas where the utility naturally is not inclined to spend money, right? And so maybe Kerry's right, like energy efficiency, demand response, those are areas where the utility is not naturally inclined to spend money. All the other things, offshore wind, solar, natural gas, coal, they are naturally incentivized to spend money on that, because that's where that's where their rate of return comes from. So it doesn't matter if it is a $4 billion natural gas plant or a $9 billion offshore wind project. It kind of, regardless of if it is clean or dirty or whatever, it's just they do not need a rack for those things, because that naturally attracts investors, especially with the biennial review. Instead, energy efficiency is not, and demand response is not something that attracts investors naturally.
Yeah.
Yes, Laura said it so much more eloquently. Thank you.
Yeah, well, any other thoughts on that question Kerry posed about where racks may be beneficial or appropriate? Energy efficiency, demand response has been mentioned. Carmen had talked earlier about potentially changing the structure. But does anyone else see an area where a rack would be the appropriate vehicle? Carmen?
Yeah, sorry. I think the idea that the rack is actually supposed to be the tool to encourage and incentivize the utility to make the investments and make plan out the projects in such a way that it fits the Commonwealth's policies and goals that have been decided by our legislature. The disconnect is that, the policies sometimes change, and the utility is not an industry that can change on a dime. And so it's difficult for that policy and those policy incentives to match up with the actual the reality of the timeline for the utilities. And I'm not going to say I don't want to be an apologist for the utility, because I'm not apologizing for the utility. I'm just stating the reality of that industry and what we have to deal with. However, we have not had the amount of interest and ability to have this kind of deep review and look at and learning by stakeholders other than the utility itself on how this is actually, how we can actually set the priorities for the utility based on what the goals of the Commonwealth are, and maintain the goals of the Commonwealth to stay as consistent as we can keep them in our policy structure, for the utility to be able to make those sound investment and management decisions. But I'm also not turning a blind eye to the fact that the utility has been the big player in how these policies and have been created at our legislature either. Some to the benefit of the utility, or not some, all to the benefit of the utility, some to the benefit of the ratepayers, just depending upon what it was that needed to be achieved at that particular point. So I think it's necessary for us to really, like with everything, the devil is going to be in the details. And if the racks are the way that we are going to, is the tool that we can use, we need to be setting up the racks and the policy around the racks in such a way that it is being, it is looking at the things that are important to us. The cost containment, a limited usage in terms of how it actually relates to what it is we want to see for the Commonwealth, what the policy goals are for the Commonwealth, and how we're going to actually achieve those, and yet still maintain enough incentive that the utility can actually obtain the necessary investment money, the investors, in order to be able to accomplish those goals.
Thanks, Carmen. Any other perspectives on what the right application of racks would be? Yes, Laura.
Yeah, I think maybe complementing what Carmen said. I think when racks started back in 2007, what the utility did was build a bunch of gas. And so, there is always a justification to de-risk operations, but now it's, the VCA. So I just want to clarify that, I think regardless of, the political opinions about it should be gas or it should be solar, at the end of the day, what we're doing in this, debate is just de-risking all the operation for the utility, and either gas or solar or offshore wind or anything. It creates a system where we all lose, and the utilities do not care because they get to build whatever, if it is solar, offshore wind, or gas, regardless. And in a totally kind of unconstrained world without risk. And in that world, we don't know if this amount of capital expenses are actually prudent I mean, the commission help us doing that, but it's not, these decisions are not being made under a market-like or correct incentive structure. So I think I explain or try to explain this at the beginning of this process, and is the goal of the regulatory structure of utility monopolies is try to replicate market incentives, right? The goal of the regulatory system for utility monopolies is not to guarantee profits for the utilities, is to make it so that the utilities operate competitively without having competition. So that's the problem with RACs, that we take over, eliminate all the market-like incentives, so they are operating and making business decisions without a structure that incentivizes to cost control and be efficient as a normal firm in the market.
Thanks, Laura. And I see Joe had a question that may be best for Dominion or OPCO, but does the RAC mechanism provide the ability to get better financing rates for large projects? Is there anybody who's able to address that? I'm not sure we have anyone from the utilities on the call, so if anyone else feels they're able to explain, feel free.
Yeah, this is John from Appalachian Power.
Oh, hey, John.
And I've just been listening to everybody's input. So I can't really speak to the latest question. I don't know about the financing differences between the RAC and the base rates. But I can say that, I've heard a lot of what I would kind of consider sort of negativity and bias towards the utilities in this discussion, and I've just trying to kind of stay out of it and just listen. I've heard the comment bandied about that the utilities just don't care, and so at a certain point, I feel like I need to step in and say we do care. We care quite a bit. It's very important to us to keep our customers' rates as low as possible. We also want to do the very best we can to comply with Virginia law. And there's a lot of requirements out there. As everyone in this group knows, we're in a changing industry. As I was thinking about the racks, and there's been a lot of talk about generation racks, but really what comes to my mind in terms of the racks that we've been dealing most with lately would be not generation related racks, but just racks that are put into place to assist the utilities in complying with new mandates from the General Assembly. And I'll give some examples. And the most recent legislation, I heard somebody mention that's correct. The SMR, the small modular reactor legislation, is going to make it easier for us to study and develop plans to potentially construct one or more small modular reactors in the state. We have RAC for demand side management. We have a RAC for percentage of income payment plan, which is a low income plan for customers. We have a RAC for extra legislatively mandated environmental cleanup. We have a RAC for energy efficiency. And of course, one of the big ones right now that we're all working with is the Virginia Clean Economy Act and the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And as probably some of the folks know, we're in a big transition period here, moving towards decarbonization. And so, the RACs are a valuable tool to assist us in that process. So anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to add there, and I will stop for now.
Thanks, John. Appreciate the perspective. Kajsa.
Yeah, John. I appreciate the perspective, and thank you for voicing up in a room where maybe otherwise you prefer to sit back and listen a bit more. And I think something that I cannot remember his name. I think it was Tom from the Connecticut People's Council who visited us in one of the very early meetings, pointed out that some parts of the process could maybe feel like the conversation was punishing the utilities for being a for-profit business. And I certainly don't think that's the sentiment maybe of the folks in this room, or at least maybe not how they're trying to come across in this space. But I can understand how it might appear that way. And I think it's important to recognize both that utilities are for-profit corporations and also work in the public interest. And sometimes as the Commonwealth goals change and as the industry change, those things can sometimes, present some tension with one another or be shifting in different ways. And so I appreciate you speaking up, but also think I just want to acknowledge that I think some of that sentiment is coming out of trying to maybe recognize that some other incentives do exist for a business that ultimately wants to attract shareholders and stay afloat. So yeah, just wanted to chime in there and say that I appreciate the perspective, and also just wanted to remind us of a moment that came early on in this process.
Thanks, Katch. So I think the last question I had on this, we've already heard about potential of putting items in racks or base rates. We've heard about other ways racks could be structured. But sort of given the mission of this group, does anybody see with items are in racks or the challenges people see with the racks, are there any other of the performance-based solutions or alternative tools that you would maybe consider as a remedy to those challenges? Yeah, but well, the good news is our next assessment exercise we'll get at that more directly if no one has any thoughts right now. Just any other comments or questions on the racks before we move on to our next mechanism?
So, Larry, this is John Lord again. I just want to say that in my question for the group for discussion, I do want to agree that the only thing I was really saying is that cost containment is not something that a rack incentivizes. It may be a good incentive for implementing renewable energy or implementing, like the percentage of income payment plan. So there may be certain features that the legislature or the Commonwealth wants to prioritize, and those prioritized goals might be worthy of a rack. But unless it's something where we're meeting a prioritized goal, it doesn't lend itself well to cost containment. So I think that those competing priorities that we talked about, how you may do, one benefit and then another a negative impact, that's exactly right. And that was really, I didn't take the time to write it into what I wrote, but I was really only commenting on the cost containment feature. So I'm not saying racks are bad and that base rates are the only way. I am saying that if our goal is to have cost containment, then racks aren't the best answer. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And then Kerry has mentioned that the PIP program, let's see, percentage of income payment plan rack was another one that she thinks may make sense in this category. So with that, we got another couple of these mechanisms to go through, but we should let's take a 5-minute break, maybe come back at 2:42, and we'll get through the rest of our material for today. Thanks. Hey everybody, welcome back. So our next performance mechanism, which gives its full title, it's the energy efficiency savings target. So that is those annual percentage targets that the utilities have to meet. And so I'll give you a minute to read through, and then we'll start our discussion on this one. Just in our last comment, I see Tanisha has a good comment about needing a little more information to better understand the viability of utilities actually obtaining their investments under RACs compared to another potential financing mechanism. All right. Well, to start this one off, again, just as you've been reading through this, is there anything that's unclear? Anything you'd like to get a slightly better understanding of the statements that are made? Okay. Then, are there any other or perspectives in this mechanism that aren't captured in what's listed here?
So Larry, just to clarify, this is Carrie Hearn. This is within the construct of a performance incentive mechanism, correct?
Yeah, well, so this we should have fully titled this. This is existing mechanisms. So this is the energy efficiency targets. So, each year the utilities have to hit a certain amount of savings compared to, I think 2019 is the baseline. So it was escalating between 22 and 25, and then the commission has just set some new targets between now and 2028. Those investments, so they receive their return on equity for those investments, and then if they overachieve in their targets, for every 0.1% of overachievement, there is a 20 basis point adder to the return on equity on the investment in the demand side management program. So that is the positive incentive. The penalty for not meeting the energy efficiency target is that it is written in the code, a utility cannot make an application for a new carbon emitting facility unless they have met their energy efficiency targets. But as with everything else in the Clean Economy Act, there is an exemption there if the facility is needed for security or reliability reasons. So that's sort of the positive and negative mechanisms here. Yes, Rachel?
Larry, I hate to be like the annoying attorney, but I just,
please.
a clarifying point on it's the commission is the entity that has the restrictions on what they can approve, as opposed to the utility necessarily being limited in what they propose in terms of whether they've met their energy efficiency standard.
Thank you. That's a good clarification.
Sure.
Yes, John?
Hi, Larry. Yeah, this is John, and I'm representing, as you know, VEPCA. So we have a separate contract with Dominion, and we've asked Dominion specifically not to include energy efficiency components inside of our contract, because we feel as local governmental agencies that we can do a better job making efficiency improvements to our operations than Dominion could do on our behalf, or even in partnership with us. And one of our member organizations is interested in having other members file public comment with the Dominion IRP proceeding at the SCC. Public comments are due by April 8th, but basically the summary of the public comment is that all these local government efficiency programs are currently not accounted for in the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, and that I believe it's Arlington County, it doesn't matter which one of our members, but it's all on the public comment page. They're suggesting that the Integrated Resource Plan should take into account the efficiency investments that are made that are not part of Dominion's efforts. Anyway, to make a long story short, I may comment a bit during this section, but I may sort of recuse myself from comment because I think this is one place where our customer group has really taken action to positively remove ourselves from energy efficiency and its rate component with Dominion. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We'll understand if you're suspiciously quiet. So yeah, anyone else see perspectives here that aren't Carrie?
Maybe I'll just sort of not tag on to that, but in that same vein of thinking about like who is the right entity to manage those energy efficiency investments, or like who holds the best incentive. And I think, this conversation around performance-based, the PBR process and performance incentives is more like internal to the utility. And I think this whole discussion will be very beneficial if we also think about like external constructs that can help achieve energy efficiency goals for the benefit of all customers. And it may or may not be a performance incentive for the utility that is the right construct for, meeting customer needs and goals. So I think like there could be a way to do it internally within the utility construct through a performance incentive, or if we want to have a bigger discussion around energy efficiency and the right tools, that could be another discussion for another workshop. But I think it's important to think about external frameworks as well, and how maybe other states have organized or structured the energy efficiency investments across their regions. So just kind of thinking about like the framework and what makes sense within a performance incentive, and what makes sense as another construct.
Thanks, Carrie. So if I'm hearing you right, thinking for certain performance areas, is the utility even the right actor to try and obtain this?
Yes. Yeah, knowing there are other models out there to think about.
Yeah. Okay. I see Katja agrees that the PIMS would be one tool to consider here, but that there might be more scope for innovation here. Because, and I suppose, would that be right in saying, Katja, that's because energy efficiency is a little more outside the utilities' core functionality?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that based on some of the regulatory assessments that I read, the comments around the energy efficiency savings targets were generally positive in that we appreciate them existing, and we think that they do important work, but it's clear that maybe the incentives that we have already created within these structures are not quite strong enough to get the outcome or the improved performance that we'd like to see. And so I think Carrie's point of thinking about how we can maybe think outside of the box, out of the traditional frameworks and tools that we already have under our belt, think about what other types of advances we could make is a smart move to be thinking about. And I think that naturally, when I was running a utility helpline, when I used to work with UPLC, I would hear quite frequently from folks who couldn't afford their utility bills, and very rarely were they being referred to energy efficiency programs or aware of energy efficiency programs. And so I think given all of the projected growth constraints and all of the other conversations and changes that are happening in the energy world right now, we should probably be doing all that we can to cover our bases and make it easy for customers to have access to things that can help them lower their bills. And so I think if we can beef up some of these programs and think about innovative ways to make them a priority for the utilities, I think that'd be great. And in future conversations, I would encourage, like, if there are ways that the current mechanisms are not strong enough for utilities to maybe like prioritize them as investments, maybe like what do we need, right? What do utilities need to be able to meet that goal? And what other options are there to also get the outcomes that, some of the other stakeholders are hoping to see out of energy efficiency and the savings that it can bring.
Thanks. So any other perspectives in the energy efficiency targets? Again, anything that's missing here, or anything you see that you largely agree with, but you might have a slightly different perspective? Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it is, it would be very interesting if, I don't think in this, space we have enough time for that, but it is just very interesting to see how, Appalachian Power Company has shown that they will exceed the targets that were put in place and that kind of, I think, pleased and will bring a lot of benefits for customers in that territory. And so it will be interesting to know, what would it take for Dominion to say, okay, this is kind of one of the main resources we're going to prioritize because it's the lowest cost and we can achieve a lot of things with energy efficiency to the maximum extent. So it's just very interesting how the set of incentives that were put in place have worked for one utility but not for the other. And so it will be interesting to learn from the utilities, like, what is it that works and what is it that doesn't. But I think there's nobody from Dominion here. But yeah, it would be interesting to hear from APCO, like how that works, and from a business perspective, is that something interesting to them? They, in recent cases, they were awarded some of the bonuses related to energy efficiency, while apparently shareholders from the Dominion are going to be missing those bonuses because they're not complying with the targets. So, just curious.
Any other perspectives on the energy efficiency targets and how they affect the different performance areas? Yeah, Rachel.
It's interesting to me that I don't really see a discussion about decoupling, and I don't know if it's just sort of because of the way the assessment was presented, but I tend to think about energy efficiency in concert with decoupling. But I don't know if this is that conversation. Sorry, I'm having a fire alarm.
Right. Well, hopefully Rachel is safe. Yeah, I mean, this is where I think decoupling would be the appropriate conversation. And I know when we went through energy efficiency as a performance area, decoupling had been mentioned. I'm happy if anyone has any thoughts on decoupling and how it could have the positive effects that maybe the energy efficiency targets have or have not had. Right. Well, if anyone wants to, we'll circle back to solutions and tools again at the end of the discussion. Is there anything else right now in terms of perspectives here that might be missing, or just things where you would have a slightly different perspective on what's written down here?
I would just also add, oops, sorry, I meant to raise my hand. I would just add that although I think it's up for discussion what decoupling would look like and whether that's the right move for Virginia or not, but I certainly do think it naturally fits into part of the conversation around energy efficiency and maybe acknowledging the fact that utilities are naturally incentivized to sell more electricity, which energy efficiency is the opposite of that. And so naturally there are some inconsistencies there. And so I think that decoupling coming up as a product of that makes sense and probably should be explored.
Yeah, let's see. Carrie agrees that the decoupling is something we'd want to see in the final report. Any other perspectives on this? Anything, as people are reading through that they would disagree with? Christian?
Just to add a one note of perspective, especially if you are a large enough business, but PJM has its own demand response program and other types of offerings available to certain types of customers. So while we are focused on utilities here and the Virginia jurisdictional utilities for good reason, there are programs available on the PJM and regional level that people do participate in and take advantage of that are outside the scope of what the utility can do.
Thanks, Christian. Laura? Sorry, Laura, I thought I saw your hand up. Christian, is your hand still up? All right. Anybody else have, again, Anything you would add to what you're seeing here? Anything missing or anything you disagree with? You know, we talked a little bit in the last section on racks on kind of the dynamics between different incentives, how you know the trade-offs you have to make. Does anyone with energy efficiency targets see any trade-offs against some of the other performance outcomes they would want to see? Oh, forgive me if that wasn't clear. Again, just thinking, you know, if you have this performance mechanism for energy efficiency savings targets, does that and that presumably positively affects or should positively affect your energy efficiency outcomes? Does it have negative effects on other outcomes, say affordability or anything like that?
Um,
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
yeah, I think, you know, what we saw, what we've seen, or what we've experienced in the last you know years is that costs are going to increase rapidly for investor-owned utilities, and we saw that, you know, we've seen that in the trends of electricity bills that customers are paying, and that particularly affects customers during the periods of highest consumption, the summer and the winter. And then energy efficiency and demand response are designed to ameliorate those impacts during those higher energy consumption periods. So, like, having utilities that perform well in energy efficiency and are looking to develop as much as cost effectively they can is absolutely fundamental for affordability. And so I guess the question is, if, you know, so if we have some targets but we have to wait and see whether or not the utilities comply with it, is I think somehow not a smart decision, because if we all know the benefits of this great resource, and we all know that the utilities have an immense incentive to prioritize capital projects over these type of investments, so we are in a situation where we don't know, like consumers and customers don't know if and how the utilities will achieve the targets, or if they are even interested in exceeding those targets. And so it, you know, it is worth considering, do we need a penalty for one of the utilities and not for the other, depending on performance, right? This is a clear performance area that the Commonwealth has said, we're interested in you reaching these targets, you have not. And so we'll be interested in if, you know, there is a way to put some enforceability, given the importance and the impacts of this resource.
Thanks, Laura. Any other perspectives on the energy efficiency targets? Yeah, Katja.
Yeah, one thing that I think has come up in this space, and I think also maybe came up in the legislative session this year, was the conversation around if there are penalties, what those penalties look like, and deficiency payments as a penalty. And I think I would just consider, I think one of the critiques of deficiency payments or penalties for compliance have been that ultimately those penalties are still paid by ratepayers because utilities pass those costs on. And so I would just say that if we are considering penalties, like figuring out how we can make those penalties not hurt the ratepayers, which is ultimately, I think, the group that we're trying to help in centering conversations around affordability and energy efficiency targets and all of those things.
Thanks, Katja. Rachel?
Sorry for the abrupt departure. I'm also curious about multi-year rate plans and sort of, as we think about a number of these components, we've talked sort of generally about what things are in concert and what's in tension. with one another in achieving the overall goal. And I'm curious about a construct that had energy efficiency goals that was also sort of in a multi-year rate plan, and if that helps achieve those goals or is indifferent or hurts it. The relationship between those two aren't clear to me, but I'd be interested in understanding that more. And I don't necessarily see that reflected in the comments on the screen.
I don't know. I don't know if any of our experts that we've had or have been able to join us today, but I don't know if there's anyone who's able to speak to that kind of the effects or how energy efficiency can operate or benefit from a multi-year rate plan. Right. Well, we'll make a note of that as something to address either here or direct to the commission as a further study item. So that would lead. I mean, our last. Sorry, Katja, did you have a point to make?
Nope, sorry.
Oh, no worries. Just again, so we've mentioned briefly decoupling multi-year rate plans. So does anyone else have comments on either of those or any of the other possible alternative tools that might be helpful when it comes to addressing energy efficiency? All right. Well, we'll move on to our next mechanism, and I think this is more a suite of mechanisms. Yeah, I think this references the current performance mechanisms in the code, which we've had the SCC and Dominion sort of outline these for us in previous meetings. So if you want to take a minute to read through the different comments here. And based on our past two discussions, would it be helpful if someone with expertise could just very quickly explain the performance adders? I don't know if someone from the SCC would be able just to kind of just at the highest level explain the ROE adjustments.
I might be able to speak a little to that. Y'all are obviously familiar, with ROE. It's the return the utility gets on their equity financed capital investment. Do you have specific questions? I'm just looking at the.
Yeah, I think that the two I was thinking of, I mean, the energy efficiency saving target is kind of a performance mechanism, but the two I had in mind around ROE were, I think there's a long-standing 100 basis points adjustment for generating plant performance, customer service, and operating efficiency. And then we have the newer 50 basis points adjustment either way. That is the subject of the ongoing case that we aren't addressing here.
Right. Yeah.
So
So
I think
oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, without addressing the case here, participants are still welcome to kind of give their perspective on that adder as it stands.
Yeah. So to date, the you mentioned the generating unit performance related adder. That's been in the code for some time. I don't, to my recollection, could be wrong. I don't believe that's ever been utilized by the commission or granted by the commission. The more recent, the 50 basis points up or down, like you said, subject to this, and that has also not been used to date. so that, they haven't been used. They, to the extent, an adder was to be implemented, that's going to increase the return on equity that the utility is authorized to earn, which all else being equal is going to increase the profit to shareholders. That's the idea, of course. Conversely, of course, a decrement applied to the ROE would reduce, all else being equal, reduce the shareholders' profit. But if people have other more specific questions about that, I'd be happy to try to address them.
Yeah, thanks for that, Patrick. Carmen, did you have a question?
Not so much a question, Larry, as a comment. I mean, one of the things that I have found most frustrating about racks and riders, regardless of what they're used for, is the fact that there's a silo on looking at these. And I think that for truly fair and balanced and affordability issues, that the commission should be allowed to look at all of these incentives and riders and the rate, the base rates in its entirety, and not allow these to be siloed. Because I think, especially looking at the issues for attention under here, the fact that the total there's the third issue noting that the total value of potential PIM rewards plus the utilities base ROE, it could be an incentive for the utility to actually over earn, and that is not the intent of what we want to do. And it especially is counter to the issue of affordability. So I think there needs to be, in redesigning some of this stuff, there needs to be a way to be fair in terms of making sure we're putting in the proper incentives, while also making sure that we are not over incentivizing an excessive profit on all of these things.
Thanks, Carmen. John?
Yeah, thank you. So I actually have kind of a out-of-the-box thought about this one, and that is there's two kind of classifications of performance mechanisms, I think, that we might be talking about based on what I'm reading in the comments. One is the ability for the utility to have its own assets perform well, like generation equipment be efficient and distribution equipment be efficient and so on. The other is affecting customers and having their homes, say, be weatherized, or having improvement to their heating and air conditioning or water heating equipment or what have you. Anyway, my thought is that I was wondering if Virginia would consider a model like the DC Sustainable Energy Utility, where the city government put out a request for proposals, and the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation won the request for proposals to basically put together a program that would serve the citizens of the District of Columbia. And it's entirely performance-based. If they don't meet the requirements of the proposal, then they get paid nothing. And so it wouldn't be the current utilities necessarily. It would be a new utility to address the needs of customers within their own homes and within their own communities. And so I don't know how familiar people are with the sustainable energy utility, but it's a really novel concept. And it's 100% performance based. And that's why it came to my mind when I was thinking about this.
Thanks, John. I see Kaj in the queue, but I was going to see if anyone had an immediate response to what John had said, and then we'll move to you, Kaj. So, Carrie?
Yeah, the other model to sort of add to that portfolio of consideration would be the Energy Trust of Oregon. So in Oregon, there's a public purpose charge. I believe this is from a couple of years ago, so unless it's changed, there's about a 3% of every non-low income customer bill, commercial, industrial, residential, et cetera, that is sort of taken from utility customer bills and allocated to a third party public-private run entity called the Energy Trust of Oregon. And it's overseen by the regulator, and it has a board of directors, again, public-private sort of oversight. And it has to report back to the legislature, and they really do a phenomenal job of marketing and providing, rebates and incentives and services to customers in the form of grants and rebates, et cetera, on energy efficiency primarily, but also certain renewable energy investments. And so, of course, like a grocery store in the industrial category would qualify for certain grants or incentives, rebates, et cetera, because they're one of the customers that's paying into that program. So everyone kind of pays in through everybody's utility bills, and then everyone is able to tap into the resource. But it is, separated out from the utility.
Thanks, Kerry. Just any other thoughts on that? All right, Katja.
Yeah, I know that we haven't, that the ongoing case on the performance adjustments is separate from this, but I just kind of wondered if there was like a general, because I see a couple of comments on the regulatory assessments that kind of said it's too soon to really evaluate this, or like we can't really evaluate this right now. So just wondered if there was like a general kind of like status update, or like a, just to like bring everyone up to speed on where that's at, and maybe how it's separate from this might be helpful. If there's someone from the commission who's able to do that.
Yeah, Brian, would you be able to just at the high level be able to speak maybe what where the case is on the 50 basis points adder?
Yeah, I can speak at a high level on this other case. So there is a separate proceeding related to possible performance-based adjustments on the combined rates of return for electric utilities. For anyone's knowledge, that case number is PUR 2023-00210, in case anyone wants to look that case up. Currently, I believe on March 7th, I think I have that date right, staff submitted a case report in that docket, which I do think included a series of recommendations, but there is no conclusion to that case at this time. There's no final determination, nor is there any updated regulations to the sort. So it is a pending case at this time. It is not final. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. So, and I just see a request of Brian, if you wouldn't mind putting the case number into the chat for people.
Yes, I can do that.
Thanks. And then Tanisha, I see you had a comment. I don't know if you want to unmute and kind of explain just I think about some of the how these things interact.
Yeah, I actually have a comment about the energy efficiency section that I didn't get a chance to make. So this was kind of going backwards. So if I don't want to interrupt the train of thought, but definitely down to come back to it once we complete this train of thought. But I guess one point that might be valuable to this that I'm wondering about is I know in the recent with the SEC setting the next set of ERS like targets and standards. In that case, there was like conversation about specifically for like around the low income targets, like the utility mentioning, specifically in Dominion, talking about not really having certain demographic data and information that folks were asking for consistently, interveners and folks were asking for. And that gave me concern about how we would track their progress on the standards that were set going forward. So I guess I'm curious about other ways that utilities that are similar to Dominion in other states that also have these targets are going about being able to provide more information on the customers that are impacted by low income energy efficiency programs. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Thanks. I don't know, does anyone have comments and kind of what verification means there might be that could be applied? Well, thanks, Nisha, and we'll incorporate that in your larger question. We'll take a look at that and put it into our further summary of this exercise. Any other comments on this performance mechanisms? Again, kind of anything that you clearly disagree with or agree with, but would tweak it slightly. Are there any alternatives in terms of performance? Any of the alternative tools you think may be more beneficial than the adders that have been put in place here in Virginia? All right. There's no more comments. We'll move on to our last mechanism. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rachel.
Sorry, I unmuted before I raised my hand, so then I was silent longer than I meant to be. I just think I think it's represented here, but I just sort of want to make sure I'm capturing it. But benchmarks and goals, I think there's an element of like tracking that I think is important in the construct of performance mechanisms that I think is mentioned a few times, metric and scorecard, but just wanting to, I guess, plus one that.
Yeah, that definitely aligns with what Tanisha says. I mean, is there any other views on that? Maybe that verification issue more broadly? Do you think do people think there's sufficient verification opportunities, data available under the current structure, or is this somewhere where the alternative tools, the different metrics and scorecards could be valuable?
I think different, like, I think metrics associated with policy mandates and parameters would be helpful, because I just sort of measuring what's currently happening versus sort of identifying benchmarks for what we'd like to see, and then, or at least what the Commonwealth would like to see generally as represented in the legal framework. Yeah, I just think, I feel like I may not be being clear, but there's a level of specificity that I think would be important to have in metrics, and understanding the alignment of sort of what you're measuring with what your desired outcome is. I think Kosh is going to help me. Thanks.
Okay, gotcha.
Oh, so sorry. I don't know if I'm actually going to help. But one thing that I was going to say about the kind of data reporting and tracking is that in other conversations around data reporting that I've had with utilities, there's been expressed concern for like privacy and customer information. And so I think that in whatever kind of tracking or systems that we set up, I think we'll have to figure out how other states are getting around those concerns, because lots of other utilities are reporting this type of data, the type of data that we might like to see that comes out of tracking. And so I just say that as like a cautionary tale, that like we can't let sometimes, what am I trying to say? I think I'm trying to say that there are concerns that we can expect will be present. I think we have to be proactively thinking around how to address some of those concerns as we propose metrics and data reporting requirements, because I've seen them come up before, and other states have figured out a way to do them. So I think it's just about figuring out how we do that in Virginia as well.
Thanks. And I see your point in the chat, John, and just want to clarify, you say key performance indicators defined, measurement and verification processes defined. You can't hit a target if the target isn't clearly visible. Are you saying that isn't present in the current scheme? Is that something that can be improved upon?
I think that the current scheme does have these things available, and we've actually got documentation that the utilities are not, in fact, meeting the defined targets. But I guess I was responding to the discussion about if we're going to be making recommendations, it might be good or it might be beneficial for the commission to see some definition around our recommendations. What are the key performance indicators? What are the kinds of measurement and verification processes? And I did put in the chat higher up a link to the DC SEU performance reports. And I know there's a ton and everybody's busy, but if you get a chance to click on one and browse through it, I think you'll see that they're incredibly specific and very detailed. And the concept of you have no return whatsoever unless you meet your key performance indicators and can prove it through a predetermined measurement and verification process, we're always going to get something less than what we really desire. And that's why I am asking the stakeholder group to consider making the recommendation that the state consider creating a secondary utility that their purpose is to provide low income affordability, energy efficiency, renewable energy transition. Like clearly the existing utilities are struggling with those goals. We can demonstrate that without being, hypercritical. We can just say that goals are defined and the goals aren't being met. So maybe it's best to let the traditional utilities stick to what they really, really are good at, which is generation and distribution. Anyway, that's a long answer for your question.
I appreciate it. And Katja.
So sorry, I keep forgetting to put my hand down.
Oh, no, easily done. Carrie?
Yes, I think John's comment is really spot on in terms of really more evaluation and opportunity to be explored in this arena of a third party entity and the prospects of that. I did want to maybe disagree or add a little bit more of my own perspective on what you said, John, which is I think a lot of the different customer categories can benefit from this type of construct beyond low-income customers. Low-income customers will absolutely see benefits in this model, in my opinion, but so would industrial customers or small businesses or moderate or even a higher income household that doesn't want to put out thousands of dollars of upfront investment or may need a little bit of a financing mechanism around an energy efficiency investment. And so thinking through the value to many different types of customer classes in that construct beyond low income customers, I think we do a really great job of sort of setting up certain constructs that benefit low to moderate income households, as we should. So I'm absolutely not saying that, we shouldn't do that, but arguing for the potential missed opportunity that we don't, sort of squeeze the energy efficiency from the system in the other customer classifications.
Thanks, Carrie. And according to the chat, John does not disagree. Any other comments on this mechanisms? All right, well then we'll move on to our last one for the day, which is the backwards looking rate reviews. Again, if you just want to take a minute to go over the comments here. And I suppose this is very much the traditional rate making. Right, and as you're finishing to read through that, again, just to start, is there anything that could use clarification? Right, so feel clear enough. And if any perspectives missing, anything anyone would add to this when thinking about backwards looking rate reviews and the impact on the different performance areas? Yes, Laura.
I just have a question, for the commission and stakeholders. I don't know if the Attorney General is also here, but one of the things that other state commissions have complained when they have either annual true-ups and biennial rate cases is that at the end of the day, these proceedings become burdensome. Like, Clean Virginia can only do so much. We cannot intervene in all the cases, so we cannot be kind of a steady intervener, which is kind of the point of the structure of the regulatory structure we have right now, is that we make sure utilities are responsible with spending. But when you have a rate case every year, that is supposed to be a thorough examination of every single little expense. I guess that increases costs for everybody, right? For the commission, for the interveners, for the Office of the Attorney General, for ratepayers, because at the end, ratepayers have to pay for the utilities expenses, litigation expenses. So one of the questions, I have for stakeholders is, it seems that, utilities, and John, I don't want to be accusatory. I just want to kind of put my understanding out there, and is that kind of utilities have an unlimited budget for litigation versus, consumer protection groups, or even the Office of the Attorney General has a budget and cannot, increase it or decrease it easily. So I'm wondering kind of what's the benefit, that if there is a benefit that the commission sees between, constantly looking at, like, every year having a rate case and reviewing having these huge cases versus the cost that it creates. So is there a benefit between having it 2 years versus every 3 years? Sorry, Larry, I'm like going all over the place, but the specific question here is, would the cost savings of having, a rate review every 3 years would be significant for everybody and for the system, and, create a longer lag where the utility has to live with the budget that was created, 3 years ago, and saving, the whole system a ton of money in litigation. Again, litigation cost that for the utilities is almost unlimited because they can just pass that through ratepayers, but for other interveners, those resources are not unlimited.
And I think Laura's last point should answer your question, John. Those the costs for litigating in the rate cases are recoverable. Any other just comments on what Laura has said? Okay, then we did have a question for clarification, I think, on the item that mentions it's a sixth one down, that if base rates were tied with the appropriate metrics, this could potentially be an effective mechanism to incentivize decarbonization. Is the person who wrote that present potentially, or could anyone kind of clarify that?
Yeah, that was me. I was just curious about, I just wanted kind of what they were imagining to be explained in terms of X being tied to whatever part of base backwards looking rate reviews being tied to some metric, and then that incentivizing decarbonization. Just an example would be helpful.
Yeah. Thanks. And that's, I'm not sure, do we have the respondent present with us?
Yeah, it's Rachel.
Rachel.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Tanisha, for the question. I think in the contract, like the current contract where there's just those 4 elements: reliability, generating plant performance, customer service, and operating efficiency. Like if that were expanded and there were appropriate metrics, and I'm saying appropriate sort of based on our VCEA, Virginia Environmental Justice Act, or like the Commonwealth Clean Energy Policy, metrics associated with achieving outcomes there, then there could be opportunities that would incent decarbonization, making different choices about how the utility is operating, whether they're maximizing demand response or optimizing distributed energy resources. So that is what that comment is meant to get at.
Okay, that's helpful. Do you know of any, I guess, any of the states we looked at that have kind of done that and then kind of have these same mechanisms?
Yeah, Hawaii has I'm trying to remember the exact name of it, but essentially like utilization of DERs is one of the things that is evaluated. I don't remember exactly if it's a PIM or if it's immediately associated with rates. They have multi-year rate plans there. So the ins and outs of how it interrelates is not entirely clear to me. I couldn't speak to those specifics. But just that there is a category and metrics identified with like increasing the utilization of distributed energy resources, in the understanding that doing so would hopefully improve overall utility operation and service provision to customers.
Right. Well, thanks for the clarity, Rachel. Does anyone else on the backwards looking rate reviews, any perspectives they think are missing, or just anything that they would have a slightly different perspective on that's listed here? I see a question from Laura for commission staff, maybe Patrick or Brian, if they're still available, is there any advantage in having rate cases every 2 years versus every 3 years? And Laura, is that specifically, an advantage in terms of commission resources, or is it more broad than that?
I guess, what we've been learning with, state corporation presentations is that basically the utility goes to the commission and says, this is what I spent. Do you think is reasonable and prudent? And this is what I'm intended to spend. Sometimes, sometimes they kind of pre-budget their expenses. Sometimes they don't. And the commission, there is a huge fight between SEC staff going through every item saying, maybe yes, maybe not. And then, the hearing examiner, sides with either the utility or SEC staff in that kind of long debate about what was spent and what will be spent. Sometimes the utility wins, sometimes the SEC staff wins, or, yeah, those are the dynamics. So my question is, having those dynamics every 2 years versus every 3 years, to budget for 3 years versus to budget for 2 years, is there any advantage of like budgeting for 2 years versus budgeting for 3 years?
Speaking from my division's perspective, and other folks may have similar or different ideas, but or perspectives, but I don't think there's necessarily And from our standpoint, from a cost and resources personnel standpoint, I don't know that there's necessarily an advantage or disadvantage to 2 versus 3 years. We've had, like you all know, we've had a period of time when there were triennial reviews, which were usually 3 years, and of course biennials every other. I don't know that from our perspective, there's pros or cons. I think from bigger policy perspective, there's things that I'm sure the General Assembly weighs pros or cons, but I wouldn't say there's advantages or disadvantages from our standpoint. Interveners with their resources may be different. They may have different perspectives, but yeah, I wouldn't say there's pros or cons from staff's perspective.
Yeah, I think I'll just jump in and speak from the other division's perspective that's also on the call that Patrick alluded to. And I'll just say I second that from a sort of budgeting and staff resource perspective. I don't think there's much of a difference between a 2-year versus a 3-year timeline. If you're talking about budget and resource concerns, I think we tend to have more questions when there's just a lot more proceedings and when there's a very notable difference in the number of proceedings. But when you're looking at, say, a base rate review going from 2 years to 3 years, just doesn't seem to impact us from a resource perspective all that much.
And is there a point at which it does? Let's say, because right now the commission is having a rate case basically every year, plus all the other proceedings. But I guess, if rate cases happened every 4 years, that would be, a significant space that would open up to analyze other things like that are more complex and that are coming up. Every legislative session you have a new docket. So is there a point where it will make a difference? But then the other question is from the customer perspective. When you set a budget, for, let's say, 3 years, again, we kind of create from the policy and incentive perspective. When you set a budget for 3 years, you again create that risk of like, okay, you have a budget for 3 years, you gotta keep it up. You have to make sure that your costs do not increase more rapidly than your revenues. And so you kind of embed that cost containment incentive when you expand the regulatory lag, instead of just being able to say, okay, my rates can be updated next year, basically every other year. Therefore, my cost containment incentives are a little less clear, right? If I have a budget for 1 year and I know I can go and ask for another budget, that's that's kind of a different incentive structure. So yeah, I guess my question is twofold. Like from resource perspective, is there an efficiency to be gained to expand a number of years that are between rate cases, and from an incentive/policy point of view, do you see any kind of advantage of like extending the period that the utility has to operate under a budget?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny when Brian was talking, I was thinking, well, now, if they did every 10 years, that might have an impact on my workload. But so yeah, I mean, difference between 2 and 3 years, it's only a year, and they're both relatively frequent. If you go to 5 or 7 or something like that, yeah, I mean, it could start to change our resource needs. Maybe. We got, we're talking about racks earlier, and of course we got the other industries regulate as well. So there seems to be a shortage of cases. But and one of the sort of considerations is one of the big ones for the frequency with which you look at base rates is the one you brought up about if you set a utilities rates today based on the costs and their budgets and things like that you can look at the longer those rates are in effect, all else being equal, and that's that's a big caveat, but all else being equal, it could put more pressure on the utilities to control costs to the longer those rates are in effect. If they could, some hypothetical state, they can only file for rates every 7 years, for example. That's going to be a very different system than, you know, than really any. I don't think that exists anywhere. But so that would be very different. So I'm rambling a little bit, but yeah, I mean, sure, there's a point at which it would matter. I don't know what that would be, and but I don't think you know, think we talked about a few different kind of rate regimes we've been under, you know, under before 2007, and then of course we had you know, triennial periods, and then we had rate freezes, and we had biennial periods that we're in now, and I think under all of those, I think there aren't any advantages or disadvantages from, again, from our perspective, not speaking to customers' perspectives. They may have different perspective, other interveners, other stakeholders. But from our perspectives, as far as resources, I don't think there's been any pros or cons under those. You know, if there was some different structure in the future that the General Assembly were to decide on as a policy matter, I, you know, couldn't speak to that hypothetical, I guess.
Yeah, I think I'll just second what Patrick said there. I think he covered it pretty well. There's probably some point where it makes a difference. Of course, all that also depends on exactly what gets proposed and approved and exactly how that process works. You know, it's a little bit of a hypothetical at this point, but at some point, as you elongate the time period between large proceedings, it would presumably make a resource difference. I don't know what that point would be, and we'd have to kind of cross that bridge when we get to it.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts on backwards looking rate reviews? Just anything that you're reading or anything that's not there? Laura?
Yeah, so, you know, reviewing testimony by the State Corporation Commission and how these cases develop. Sometimes, you know, the State Corporation Commission does this staff does this thorough review, and, you know, they make these specific suggestions, and then the hearing examiner kind of decides one way or another. But then there are these settlements, and so in these settlements, you know, a lot of the things that the State Corporation Commission staff kind of flagged basically are ignored, and, you know, certain things, or like the major things, are prioritized. And so my question is, like, how do you deal with the fact that you this on, but then at the end of the day, you have the settlement that narrows down the issues and, you know, allegedly results in like win-win solutions, but then all the nitty-gritty analysis is kind of quote unquote wasted because you got a settlement agreement. But I don't know, that's kind of one of the, you know, one part of the systems that I think waters down the thorough review that the commission does, the commission staff does, and all the resources that everybody puts into it. That might result in benefit for ratepayers, not denying that. But at the end of the day, you know, a lot of the issues that were analyzed cannot be addressed by the commission. I don't know if that's a fair assessment.
Well, yeah, I suppose that it could be part of this. So I think if I'm hearing you right, you that ability to create the settlements or stipulations, as they're often called, maybe circumvents a complete record in the case. Is that accurate?
Yes, but I have not done enough research into kind of the effects of stipulations to make that statement, but it's something, you know, something that happens in these cases very often. And as we have them, you know, every 2 years, it's going to be very hard for the commission to decide in every single, you know, item that the commission thoroughly reviews. And so that's kind of part of the system, the stipulations. Yep, that's right, Larry. Sometimes those stipulations do not allow for like a record creation or sending signals to the utility about what is prudent spend and what is not.
Thanks. Then Christian.
Just to comment on the settlement aspect. Stipulated settlements are still subject to commission approval, and the parties participating in the case still need to create a record to support that settlement. And so that oftentimes involves the admission of testimony that was pre-filed and perhaps the elicitation of additional testimony for why the settlement is reasonable and in public interest. There can be instances where the hearing examiner is skeptical of settlement, and so ask the parties to create a more fuller record. Anybody who's on this call who participated in Dominion's last biennial review probably experienced that, where we had a hearing examiner who's still interested in a number of different issues and exploring a number of different topics with a number of different witnesses, despite the fact that the case was settled. But I think that to Laura's point, settlements are often black box, where it doesn't, where a revenue requirement or a certain numbers will be agreed to without any concessions around anybody's points of whether or not they were correct or incorrect. But nonetheless, the settlement itself needs to be supported by the evidence and needs to be found reasonable in public interest by both a hearing examiner as well as the commission. So there is still a significant amount of public process that goes into it, even when there is a stip.
Thanks for that background, Christian. And then we have a comment, I think direct towards the SCC, that during the SCC presentation, it said the triennial reviews did not work well for Virginia, or that they had some unique challenges. And then the question is that because we had just come out of the rate freeze that made that more complicated, or I suppose is there something about triennial reviews that makes them more challenging? And just to clarify, Tanisha, was that a comment from the SCC?
Yeah, that was a question for the SEC. I think it might have been Kim Pate who gave the presentation, but I just remember a comment about that I wasn't quite clear on. Now seems like the right time to ask about it.
Yeah. Is anyone from the SEC able to help?
Yeah, just to clarify, are you suggesting this was a comment made by staff during that presentation? Is that your recollection? I just want to make sure I clarify the comment.
Yeah, we were talking, I think it was like in the Q&A section, we were kind of talking about the different types of biannual, the frequency that we have had, which has been, I think, between 2 and 3. And there was a mention that there were some challenges, I think, specifically with the 3, but it wasn't really elaborated on.
Yeah, and I don't recall that offhand. And as you mentioned, it was our accounting director, Kim Pate, that provided that presentation. And unless Patrick can think of something more specific, I don't think I would be in a position to be able to elaborate on that comment.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. I wasn't part of that presentation, so I just don't know the context of that comment, or couldn't really elaborate on it, unfortunately.
Understood. I'll go back and watch the recording maybe I can get some clarification myself.
Sure.
Right. Well, before we finish up in this one, are there any alternative solutions, performance-based tools that any stakeholders would suggest in lieu or to complement backwards-looking rate reviews? I suppose that the multi-year rate plan would be the most obvious one, if anyone has a perspective on how that might compare. All right. Well, that sort of concludes our main discussion for today, but I think that will, in terms of thinking about what tools we might want to look at, that segues into the last part of our program for today, where we just want to introduce our next assessment, because we got such great responses to the ones looking at our current structure. We've now designed one that would look ahead at some of these possible alternative tools. And the idea is that this would work in concert with the final written comment opportunity that is out there. So, I know, Johnny, if you're able to advance to the next slide. Sorry, forgive me. In fact, what we'll do is Dan Crosscall from Current Energy, they're one of the groups working with the SCC in the study. He should be able to kind of walk us through this next assessment and how it would work. Are you there, Dan?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Larry. Thanks for your facilitation throughout today. So, as Larry said, Jonica shared this document with the meeting agenda earlier today, and I just wanted to quickly talk through it, but recognizing it's new in everyone's hands. The assessment of the current regulatory structures that we've gone through today was, I think, successful and extremely helpful to us as we review and understand ideas and positions from all the participants. So again, CEG, Current Energy Group, is working with Great Plains Institute, helping the SCC and the department in this process. And in that regard, we also assisted with the creation of this PBR assessment tool, which I'll screen share here. So first off, the concept and the suggestion is to use this with your filed comments if you plan to submit those, so that it hopefully is not a significantly additional burden, but rather can be supportive of your work in those comments. So the ask is to include this with comments that you may file on April 11th. And also in that regard, we're suggesting that the answers inside the template can be relatively short, 200 words, for instance, per question, just so it's complementary or in addition to your other comments that you may be preparing. But we do ask that you use the template as it is presented here, and I'll say more on that in a moment. But if participants, if in your comments you can directly apply the table and fill out questions in the template structure as you did on the regulatory assessment, that is very helpful to the department and then ultimately to the commission and to us to understand your positions. And in this form, it is very instructive and organized. So a couple other things to highlight that I've just shown in green is we're asking you can conduct this assessment for up to 3 PBR tools or other regulatory tools. So 1, 2, or 3, please. And that allows some focus on reforms or alternative rate making tools and PBR tools that could be helpful to address opportunities or shortcomings in Virginia. We include at the top some light definitions of the main tools that have been discussed and that were put forward in the legislation. So these are here for your reference, although we recognize there are different definitions and understanding of those in some cases. And so any participants invited to add your own definitions or refine these if helpful. And you can do that directly in this template or in your accompanying comments. To the template itself. So the ask would be to select per table, per submission, 1 regulatory mechanism or PBR mechanism or alternative tool and conduct the review for that. And this is on a prospective basis, what reform could be considered or designed. And these are straight from the legislation. There is an other category, so you're welcome to put forward something different. For instance, there was discussion today of the concept for an energy efficiency utility, and that's the type of thing that perhaps you could focus this work on, is something not contemplated currently in the legislation, but you could focus on it. Likewise, the legislation provides 6 objectives, and we wanted to re-elevate those and ask for each mechanism that you are putting forward, identify up to 2 objectives that you think it would most directly support. And then of those performance areas that we have discussed, up to 3 of those performance areas could be selected. So, you can select affordability and cost-efficient investments or what have you, but up to 3, just forcing, while some of the mechanisms, of course, support more than one area, force some focus or emphasis on where you're most concerned or think it could be supportive. And then for these, again, please limit to about 200 words per response. But if you could step through the questions here and answer these, and we hope this is pretty pointed and gets at the heart of the concepts and how they could be designed and what they can support. I'll highlight a couple of things. Like question 2 is asking what components of the utilities cost or revenue requirements would it address? And I consider this kind of the where of the question. Most incentives are directly going to relate to some cost component or feature of the utilities revenue collection. So can you identify those? Key design attributes is helpful if you can describe, for instance, if you're putting forward a concept for a multi-year rate plan and you have ideas for how many years it should be, or things that should be considered, like design of a productivity factor or other components that may be in a multi-year rate plan. Tell us about that, or at least highlight them here, and you can expand upon it in your comments. Other interactions, potential interactions with other mechanisms, whether existing mechanisms or proposed, can be discussed here. And hopefully these other questions are relatively straightforward or self-explanatory. But again, this can assist, I think, in what you may already be preparing. But we're interested in this kind of structured answer to highlight and understand what PBR reforms could be contemplated. That's all. So I see one question.
Thanks, Dan. I just want to make sure I'm following you, that comments in the abstract are not what you all are looking for. It's this form. And if there are comments, then they are to be comments that are referencing back to elements here to further explain them.
So you have the opportunity to submit comments. And I think those have been broadly, open-ended comments are invited. And so this can accompany those comments. So specifically, you can attach this directly into those comments. It could be, right at the end of written comments, if that's how you're preparing it. But please answer directly in the template, in this Word document form that you now have. And if you really want to say a lot more than the suggested 200 words, there's opportunity for that in your accompanying comments. Does that answer it, Rachel?
I'm going to try again, because you answered something, but I'm not sure that what I'm trying to understand is, like, if there are comments and there is no form completion, is that an acceptable submission on April 11th? Or are you looking for this form to be completed, and to the extent that there are comments, that the comments are just further explaining what is already identified in the form? Like, if the form doesn't get to you, but comments get to you, is that okay?
Yeah, the department and I think we will be looking at everything you submit. This form is an opportunity to focus those into what we believe are particular common design features or areas for attention in that. So yes, you could submit comments without this form, but our ask is, as you may be proposing particular PBR reforms, use this to focus on some areas of interest.
Thank you.
And your comments, to be clear, your comments can and may go beyond this, right? You may be commenting on other things in the proceeding to date or other points you need to make.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Sure. Anything else that I can answer? We're over time, I just realized. Then I'll pass it back to you, Larry.
Thanks, Dan. And I see your question, Katja. We were just thinking end of the day on the 11th. I think that's a Friday. And so it should be, I think it's the the day after our next meeting, just because then, you know, hopefully as people are preparing comments, if they are in the next couple of weeks, if there's anything from that meeting that they want to just add at the last minute, to give some time to make those adjustments. And I see Laura's question, can we have some other experts invited to the meeting to solve questions? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Just let us know who you have in mind. We have, obviously we have Current Energy and GPI who are working with the SCC, and then there's RMI and RAP have been attending as they can. They have open invitations. I don't know if anyone was able to make it today from either of those organizations, but if there's someone else you want to invite, just let us know and we'll add them to the mailing list. Okay, Johnny, would you be able to bring up just our last couple of slides? We'll go through what's next real quickly and then let everybody go. So as Dan mentioned, we have that assessment, which can be, those can be your comments, or they can work in concert with your comments, whatever's next. They're due April 11th. That'll give us some time to put a summary into the final report. And then our final due date for that report to the SCC is the 9th of May. I think we've mentioned previously, we have to do some internal executive review here. So we need to have that really out of our office a couple of weeks before that. If you go to the next slide, Jonica. So our next meeting will be 10th of April in the afternoon. We're still putting this agenda together, you know, based on our discussion today and what we've seen from the regulatory assessment and our survey. But as of now, we plan RMI are going to give us you know, a kind of evaluation of the current performance mechanisms in the structure that exists today, because I believe that was requested by a few stakeholders last time around. We're going to have a discussion on carbon leakage from Virginia Manufacturers Association. They'll lead that. That's an issue that's mentioned in the resolution that I don't think we've touched upon yet. Similarly, we're still deciding how to structure it, but we'll have some kind of discussion on the regulation of competitive service providers. That is called out in the resolution. We just want to make sure we address that before we finish up. In the last meeting, 22nd of April in the afternoon, and that will primarily be about reviewing the draft report. We'll be trying to get a draft to you in advance of that, and then have our last discussion to make sure we've got the right content in there, the right recommendations, and that everything is accurate. Yes, the RMI overview is specifically about Virginia. Right. Does anybody else have any questions? Yep, Carrie.
This may be unique to me, and if it is, just feel free to ignore it, but the Environment Virginia Symposium out in Lynchburg wraps up at like noon on the 10th. So I don't know if that scheduling is going to be challenging for anybody else in terms of traveling back from Environment Virginia Symposium, but I recognize schedules are tight and you guys have a deadline. So
yeah, and maybe what you, we based this on our calendar poll that we sent out, but if other people find they have that same clash, maybe just email us, and if you know we see there's a lot of emails coming in, we'll think about rescheduling. All right, any other questions or comments before we close up? All right. Well, thank you again for giving us your Friday afternoon, and hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great couple weeks.